Welcome everyone to Intentional Self-Care presented by NAMI Southeast Minnesota. My name is Matthew Bjorngard. I will be the facilitator today. Just a little bit of background about me before we get started. I am currently the executive director at NAMI Southeast Minnesota. I've been married for almost 5 years. We have 2 dogs, 2 corgis specifically. You can see their pictures on the screen. Peanut is the one on the left. Paisley is the one on the right. I am a member of the Society of Public Health Education. I'm also on the board of directors for Family Service Rochester here in Minnesota. I do have a few formal mental health diagnoses. I have generalized anxiety disorder, also have persistent depressive disorder. And then in terms of my experience as a facilitator, in my previous career over at IBM, I did facilitate some classes specifically to new hires on the stresses of making that transition either from job to job or maybe from school to job. I've also been in a few different article features, for both Thrive Global and Authority Magazine. And then my email is also included here on the screen. Just in case anyone wants to reach out after the course for more information. So what are we going to go over today? Number one, I want to talk briefly about really what is self-care. Talk about why self-care is important. Give some practical self-care examples, things that are easy to implement, things that virtually anyone can do. And then I want to talk about how we can be intentional about utilizing self-care and incorporating it into our daily routines. And then we'll wrap up with some quick next steps and additional resources that you all can utilize if you want to know more or learn more. So first and foremost, what is self-care? There are a few different general definitions of self-care, but these 3 that I put on the screen I like the best. Number 1 is self-care is just being mindful of your own needs. The World Health Organization says that it is your ability to promote health, prevent disease, and maintain your health without the support of a healthcare provider. And then the third one is it's recovering or your ability to recover from daily emotional fitness. So what do I mean by emotional fitness? I like to compare the daily, mental grind that we all have with physical exercise. If you were to physically exercise, work out, go for a run, go for a walk, right? It's second nature for most of us to know that, hey, at some point in time, you need to be able to rest and recover your body, from that fitness, from that exercise. Your brain works in very much the same way. Each day, we all deal with stress, depression, critical thinking, right? Having to, go through our work days, whatever it might be. In a lot of cases, that's some heavy lifting, for our brains in and of itself. So we also need time to rest, to, recover our minds. And in my opinion, that is what self-care is all about. The last thing I'll mention is, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, anxiety disorders are reaching epidemic proportions. In a given year, nearly 50 million Americans alone will feel the effects of panic attacks or phobias, other anxiety disorders. So, self-care is definitely an important topic for us to chat on because it really helps everyone. So a little bit more about what self-care is, and just as important, what self-care is not. So self-care is changing your thoughts and your behaviors to better contribute to your well-being. It is not indulging yourself. Self-care is resourcing yourself so that you can take care of yourself and others. Self-care is not selfish. Self-care is an ongoing practice. And that's really the main topic, behind this conversation today, is being intentional about, creating an ongoing self-care practice. Self-care is not a one and done thing. Self-care is a matter of changing the intention of your everyday activities. It's not something that has to be time consuming. Similarly, often self-care is free. It's not something that has to be expensive. And a lot of the specific exercises or self-care activities that we talk about today fall under the category of being free and not really taking much time out of our days. So that's a little bit more about what self-care is and what it is not. Let's talk about why self-care is important. So there's a number of things on the screen, just starting from the top and moving our way down. Self-care encourages us to maintain a healthy relationship with ourselves. Studies have shown that self-care practices are proven to reduce anxiety, depression, and stress. Also helps to improve concentration, minimizes our frustration and our anger, and increases our happiness. Self-care is also linked to us living a longer, happier, healthier life. There is a lot of opportunity for improvement, however. Currently, only about 39% of men and 32% of women consistently make time for self-care. So that's why conversations like these are so important. Because it is something that everyone, in my opinion, can benefit from. So we've talked about, what self-care is, what it isn't, why it is important. What are some examples of what self-care can be? So self-care can be things as simple as asking for help, as spending some quality alone time, putting yourself first, asking for what you need, setting boundaries, staying at home, saying no, being forgiving of yourself and compassionate with yourself, and also, taking a step back, right? Just taking a breath. You'll notice that none of these things, really take much time, out of your day, and all of these things are, free, right? They come at no cost. Some other examples of what self-care can be and examples of things that you can do to do more self-care with throughout your day that really don't take much time are listed here now on the screen, right? Things like just making your bed or drinking water, lighting a candle, having a snack. One of my personal favorites, listening to music. Right? All of these are different forms of self-care. And I guarantee all of us at different times, right? We do a lot of these things, but we may not necessarily be consistent about them. We may not be intentional about ensuring that some pieces of self-care are always going to be around in our daily lives. One of the other common themes between the self-care items listed here and on the last slide is self-care doesn't have to be complicated. Right? It's also going to look different for everyone. So it's important to understand, hey, what things bring you joy? And we will talk more about that when we get to the portion about how to be intentional when practicing self-care. A little bit more about some self-care practice examples, and also how I tend to categorize the different types of self-care is broken up here on this slide. So I like to think of self-care as being broken down into 4 different categories. There's physical self-care, things like dancing or taking a shower, eating healthy food, taking a nap, right? Those all, in my opinion, fall under the physical self-care type. Mental self-care are things like practicing breathing exercises or journaling, again, listening to music, one of my personal favorites, drinking herbal tea, which I'm doing right now, or even more intangible things like practicing self-compassion and self-forgiveness. The third category is intellectual self-care. So these are things where we're kind of stimulating our brain in a way that's outside of our daily routines, right? Reading a book, taking a class, really just learning new things. attending events like plays or concerts, going to the movie theater, right? These all, in my opinion, count as types of intellectual self-care. And then the fourth type of self-care is spiritual. So these are things like practicing yoga. Now, obviously, yoga can probably fit under a couple of these different categories. And that's true for most of these. But I like to break them up into kind of like how I primarily think of them. So getting out in nature, that is an example of spiritual self-care. Practicing gratefulness. One thing I try to do in my everyday routine when I get up in the morning is write down one thing that I'm grateful for. It's such a little thing. And early on, I didn't think that it was going to make much of a difference, but it really does set the trajectory of my day on a whole different path than, if I didn't do that consistently. And now some of these things, right, we will feel the positive effects of right away. Some of them, it takes some time, like practicing, gratefulness, for me, at least as an example. But all of them over time do provide, some positive mental health. And again, we're all different. Some of these things are going to work better for us than others. Some of these you may not be interested in at all. So it's just a matter of, kind of trial and error, right? Doing some of the things you already know that you like, maybe trying some new things, but just making sure that we are, again, consistent and intentional about practicing self-care, whatever that means to us. So now we've talked about some examples of, self-care activities, the types of self-care. Now let's touch on how we can be intentional about practicing self-care. So for me, it's a matter of doing it in 3 steps. Number 1 is reflecting on what we currently do in terms of our self-care activities, what things do bring us joy, things that maybe we could start implementing into our daily lives as opposed to things that, we maybe do on occasion. Number 2 is to then create a self-care roadmap, basically starting with one activity, that you can incorporate into your routine in the next week and try your best to commit to that. And then over time, we can start implementing, maybe more intentional self-care items. For me, again, going back to the types of self-care, I try to do one self-care item from each of those 4 categories every day. Now, I don't anticipate anyone else on this call to do that, right away. And that was definitely not something that I did right away. But it's just a matter of building that self-care roadmap and slowly, building on your self-care over time. Because even those 4 or 5 items that I do every day generally take me maybe 5 minutes to do. So then the third thing after creating that roadmap is to, set ourselves up to create some accountability so that we can continue to be intentional about practicing the self-care. So let's dive in a little bit more into the details on each of these 3 steps. So number 1 is self-care reflection. So what I would like all of you to do, if you're interested, is take a minute or 2 to jot down some quick responses to these questions up on the screen. Number 1 is, hey, what self-care am I doing now? Number 2, do I make self-care a daily routine or a daily priority? If I do, why do I make it a priority? If not, why don't I make it a priority? Number 3, what activities bring me joy? And then number 4, of those activities in answer number 3, or maybe something else that you've just thought of, what is maybe one activity that you can incorporate into your daily routine here in the next week? So I'll give everyone just a minute here to think about that and maybe jot down a couple of notes. and then we will move on to the next step. All right. If you're still jotting some notes down, feel free to continue. No rush, but I will start talking about that second step in making sure that we're being intentional about our self-care. So step 2 is to create a self-care roadmap. What I have on the screen here is just an example of a self-care roadmap that I had initially created when I was first kind of going down this route. So you can see that I broke up my self-care routines by the 4 categories that I had mentioned a little bit ago. And I had broken it down by weeks. So the way I started, right, I picked one activity that I wanted to do every single day. And that was the only specific commitment I was making. And it was a commitment that I was making to myself. So I began in the physical category because in my mind, or at least for me, it was easier to start in that area and maybe make a commitment to myself. So I started by just doing daily walks, right? And that was the only specific self-care commitment that I made to myself every single day. And I did that for a couple of weeks before I then added one other piece of self-care into my daily routine. And that was moving over to the spiritual type of self-care. I began making daily gratitude statements, right? Writing down one thing that I was grateful for. Now, if you choose to do that now or in the future, you can keep a running list of those things. You can file them away. You could even potentially throw them away at the end of the day. The important thing is that you're taking that moment to think about things that you appreciate, things that you're grateful for, and physically writing them down. Again, that is something that can take 30 seconds. And then you can see some of the other examples of things that I slowly added into my routine as the weeks went on. I continued to do my daily walks along with my daily gratitude statements. Eventually, I started committing to myself that I wanted to read 15 pages every day. I love reading, but I'm so bad at committing myself to reading consistently. I have friends and family members that will tell me that they read 12 or more books a year, 20, 30 books. And, to me, that's mind blowing because I'm lucky if I pick up a book, once a month. So that was another thing that was important to me, is just to be intentional about doing some form of reading. Now, for me, it was, hey, I'm committing myself to reading 15 pages a day. Another example would be, hey, I'm going to commit to reading for 20 minutes a day or even 10 minutes a day. But again, this was just a commitment that I was trying to make to myself. So again, your self-care roadmap might look similar to this. It might look completely different. The important thing is that we make a plan of attack. And again, start small and we can build it. We can build as we go. So another thing I would encourage you to do is, based on the answers that you had in step 1 and maybe some of the activities that you enjoy, maybe again, pick one of those things and plot that in your self-care roadmap and try to commit to doing that for, at least the next week. Now, I keep saying, hey, committing to myself, making a commitment to doing these things every day, being intentional about it. It's one thing to think about it, to write this down on paper. It's a whole nother thing to actually do these things. So that's why the third step in this process is to try and create accountability. So the final step in being intentional about our self-care is creating accountability. I don't know about you guys, but my future self often tries to sabotage plans that I've already made. I cannot trust my future self to carry out the plans that I've made. So I typically need to come up with a plan that helps to defeat my future self. In other words, I develop a system of self-accountability. Accountability by its very nature is a personal endeavor. As the definition implies, it's about being responsible for our own actions, and only we can ever be responsible for our own actions, not someone else. But, what are some things that we can do to create this accountability system? And I will tell you before I start giving examples, don't be afraid to be ridiculous in coming up with ideas on keeping accountable. A couple specific ideas that I personally like is, number one, to tell one other person that you have made this self-care commitment, right? You're basically giving yourself an accountability partner. Personally, I believe that it's important to have a support system in place for any ventures in life. And this also includes building habits and achieving goals. Because ultimately, by being intentional about having a self-care routine, that's building a habit. So my suggestion would be, once you've decided on this one activity that you want to commit to, tell one other person, that you are going down the self-care route. It could be a friend, a family member, coworker, a therapist, whoever you feel is within your support system. Just having someone else be aware that you are trying to do this tends to create some additional accountability. And going back to me saying, hey, don't be afraid to be ridiculous or creative in coming up with ideas to stay accountable. You could even ask this person to assist you on your journey. Tell them to set up weekly check-ins with you just to see how things are going. Have them join you in your self-care commitment, right? If your commitment is to go for a walk every day, see if this person will also, go for that walk with you. You could also have them send you reminders each morning. Really anything to help keep the momentum going. You'd be amazed at how much of a difference, the little things like that can make. Other systems that I personally use to help, set up a few self-accountability protections include, daily reminders on my phone or alarms. Another thing that I find very important is to think of, a self-care practice or a self-care activity as something just as important as an appointment or a meeting, right? So if I have a doctor's appointment on my calendar, you better bet I am going to do everything in my power to make sure that I do not miss that appointment. I do the same thing with my self-care routine, because this is just me keeping an appointment with myself. So for me, just as another example, I put an hour on my calendar every single day to try and commit to taking a break for lunch. Right? That is just one example of, an appointment or a meeting that I make with myself to help promote, being intentional about my self-care routine. So those are just a couple of examples of things that you can do to help create accountability. On this next slide here, I've listed a few others that I think are kind of fun, and we can go through them just quickly here. Number one, I already mentioned, right? Create daily reminders, put on your phone, in your calendar, whatever works for you. You could even write it on a sticky note and stick it on your bedroom door so that every day before you leave your bedroom, that reminder is right in front of you. Also mentioned finding an accountability partner. There are even services online, for example, getmotivatedbuddies.com, that will help you and you find an accountability partner for someone who's maybe going on a similar journey. So I think that's a pretty neat idea as well. Another thing that you can do to be accountable for yourself is to try and prepare ahead of time. So just as an example, if you want to exercise in the morning, maybe lay out your clothes next to your bed or in your bathroom, or have your gym bag packed if you go to the gym, right? That's going to encourage you to, it makes you more likely to follow through with that commitment that you made to yourself. Another thing that I have tried in the past, if you are a person that typically sets an alarm or needs to set an alarm, set it far away from your bed so that when that alarm goes off, it forces you to get up and out of bed to shut it off in the morning. This is, again, something that I've used before because I like the snooze button. There are also apps out there like Stick or Beeminder or Pact. These are all free apps that do their best to try and keep us accountable for whatever specific habit we're trying to build, self-care routine we're trying to build, goal we're trying to accomplish. Another thing that I would say is just as important is to make sure you don't overcommit. And that's why I've been very clear about, hey, if you want to start being intentional about self-care, just pick one thing, right? Pick one thing, see if you can stick with it for a while. And once you're comfortable, then maybe you can add something else, onto your list. Number 7 here, I've already mentioned this as well, right? Plan your tasks, your self-care activities, like you're scheduling an appointment. If you want to, take a nap every day, schedule that into your day, right? It makes you more likely to commit to that. And you will feel less guilty about taking some time out of your day to do that because it's already in the plan, and you can schedule any other things around that as needed. Another thing that I'll just mention that is potentially helpful is to eliminate other distractions while you are attempting to go through and do this, whatever's the self-care routine it is that you're doing. If you tend to be someone that sits in front of email or sits in front of your phone or likes to play video games, right? Lock them up, put them away, give them to somebody else, right? Whatever, again, be creative. Don't be afraid to be ridiculous, because these are all things that are going to help you commit to a self-care routine. I'll also mention reward yourself. If you've been able to stick to a daily walk every day for a week, do something special. For me, I like donuts. So for me, it might be treating myself with a donut. But again, whatever that thing is, it's good to give ourselves some positive reinforcement when we are accomplishing, our intentional self-care. And the final one I will mention, and this is similar to, making sure you don't overcommit yourself, have a plan B. Life doesn't always go the way that we expected. So, have a backup plan in mind, or, allow for additional open space in your schedule. Give yourself a break, right? We're all humans. No one is perfect. I think just the fact that you guys are all on this call and willing to hear what I have to say about self-care, means, that means that you are trying. And so if you do commit to a daily walk, for example, and you miss a couple of days, don't be hard on yourself. Just get back to it when you can. So those are some additional, tips, suggestions that I would give in terms of trying to keep ourselves accountable to committing to this routine. Now let's just talk about where we can go from here. So some of the next steps that I would encourage all of you to do, and a lot of this we've already gone over, right, is finish your own self-care roadmap. Maybe map out a roadmap for the next 3 months. If that's too big of a commitment, again, just start with 1 week, right? What's the one activity that you want to try and commit to for the next week? See how this week goes and start again next week. Going back to the example that I showed earlier, right? I had it planned out for 12 weeks and I slowly over the course of those 12 weeks added one by one some additional self-care routines into my day. Again, once you have completed that roadmap, or once you have committed to the one activity that you want to do what you can to keep yourself accountable. Tell one other person, see if they want to join you on this journey. And then also set up your own accountability protections. Just like how I mentioned that not, every self-care activity is going to work for everyone. Not everyone is interested in dancing, for example. I'm not really interested in dancing, right? So it's just a matter of figuring out what works for you. And ultimately, it's trial and error, right? Life is meant to be lived and enjoyed. And, there's nothing wrong with trying something and it doesn't work, try something else. The more important thing is that we are trying. Again, give yourself a break. I'm not perfect. No one is perfect. So, if things don't always go according to plan, that's okay. And then the last next step, as far as, coming out of this class that I would highly suggest is just continue to explore, continue to learn. I will provide some resources here on the next page as far as potential starting points if you're interested. But continue attending classes like this. Just educate yourself, be curious. I think those are also important things to do in life, and especially if we want to build a self-care routine. So finally, I mentioned some additional resources. I just listed 4 on here. So obviously, I'm the executive director for NAMI Southeast Minnesota. We have a lot of different mental health resources. We also have support groups. We have a lot of stuff, not only on our website, which is listed, also at our office. Feel free to check out the email or check out the website, email, call us, stop by. We're always here to help. I would also suggest, and this is specific for folks that are more local to Southeast Minnesota, Family Service Rochester. They have a lot of counseling services, welfare programs, right? Things that complement, our own self-care. And then a couple of other kind of outside resources that I would suggest. One is a productivity and self-care planner. If you are the type of person that enjoys, having a planner or keeping a daily routine, I would suggest the mental fitness planner. A lot of what is included in that planner is very similar to some of the steps that we just went through in terms of being intentional about creating a self-care routine. We also do have a 50% off code if you want to check it out and use NAMI Care. So that is another resource that I would suggest. And then finally, a podcast that I have found helpful that talks a lot about self-care, mindfulness. There's a lot of different topics to it, but it's called the Mindful Kind podcast with Rachel Cable. That is just a podcast that I would recommend, not necessarily specific to self-care, but just for, being more mindful about ourselves, about our own mental health, I think that's a good resource as well. So with that, that is the main portion of the intentional self-care skills session. I want to thank all of you for joining. I will now stop the recording and we can open it up to any questions that folks have. If you give me just a moment.